Good afternoon. History is pretty neat. Everything has a history. It has a story. And it actually allows you to understand a bit better where certain things come from or why certain things are as they are. Even for us in Mexico, the taco has a certain history. Historians have said that it comes from the word tlaco, from the native language of Nahuatl, which means in the middle or in the center. So it actually refers that the content should be put in the middle. In Mexico, we have a lot of tacos. So depending on the taco, you can actually build your own taco. We have tacos de canasta, taco de suadero, taco de pastor. And it all relies on the base. Based on that, you can actually add certain content on it. You can add onions, lime, you can add different types of sauces. And it all depends on the region where you are, the culture, the habits. Because not every type of ingredient can be found in these same regions. Now, there's one common denominator of all these tacos, and it's one thing, la tortilla. In 40 producing countries, we have one common denominator, that's coffee. And on the base of its history of the country and of its culture, coffee is managed in different types of forms. Mexico also has that history. Government institutions are often called upon when there are agriculture emergencies. Today I want to share with you on how Mexico, the government, responded to leaf rust and how shared investment is needed in order to make sure that such a disaster will not happen again. Coffee came into Mexico, to Veracruz, the harbors, in the late 1800s. And it became one of the most important agriculture products for Mexico. From there on, it grew, and it grew rapidly in a certain sense. Why? Because public policy became also involved in that sense. In 1949, under the presidency of Miguel Alemán, the National Coffee Commission was set up. And the aim of the National Coffee Commission was actually to improve coffee plantation, develop research services, and set up credit lines. As you can hear, these are all topics that are still valid till this day in many of the countries that we're working in. By the end of during this period, the coffee production actually reached production until 1.1 million bags. 15 years later, the National Coffee Institute was introduced, Anacafé, in 1963. And its focus at that point in time was price controls and export permits. And this was in compliance with the international coffee agreements of that time. But it went further than that. Mexico at that time had these rural development policies where they actually had quite some regulation when it comes to agriculture policies. They wanted to control it. So Anacafé went a step further, and they actually started to pre-finance harvest. They started to buy coffee, and even extended its services to the transport and to the processing of coffee. By the end of '63, we actually reached a peak in production and reached to 5 million bags. What happened next? Well, it all collapsed. In 1982, we had an economic crisis. Due to a decline in oil revenues and due to loans that were not paid by the banks, basically what happened is that the state could not service anymore all those services that were serviced to the agriculture sector. Even Anacafé, it had to diminish its services. In 1989 and 1993, the international coffee agreements collapsed as well. International prices declined by 50%. So combined with what happened in Mexico and with this situation globally, the revenue of Mexican coffee farmers dropped by 65%. And of course, it also had a consequence to the production of Mexico. In 1991, we monitored 5.2 million bags. 2 years later, in 1993, we reached a drop of 4.1 million bags. In that same year, Anacafé was also dissolved. Again, a gloomy outlook. So what happened then? Basically, these farmers were all quite vulnerable. There were no more subsidies, there were no more support, and there was a free market where they were exposed to. There were a couple of producers that were able and actually to differentiate themselves. One of the ways that they did it in Mexico was through the differentiation of agriculture, organic agriculture. In that sense, they were able to differentiate themselves and had a bit more of a stable income versus the conventional prices at that time. So, having little incentive to invest, as there was no support from the government, Mexican coffee producers, in that sense, needed to have, again, that support, but there was none. By harvest 2015 and 2016, we have hit an all-time low. We produced at that time 2.3 million bags, and we imported 2.7 million bags. For the first time in our history, we were deficit. Partly has to do a bit with the coffee sophistication era we're going through. We're currently now more than the half of our coffee that we produce stays in our country because we consume it. Mexico has 15 producing estates with over around 600,000 farmers. The majority of these estates have different indigenous groups in their estates. We have Chiapas, Veracruz, Oaxaca, Puebla. These 4 estates account for 84% of all the Mexican production. But then next to this, we have 11 more estates. We have Guerrero, Nayarit, San Luis Potosí, Hidalgo, Querétaro, Tabasco, Estado de México, Colima, Jalisco, Michoacán, and Morelos. That's a lot of coffee everywhere. It's quite dispersed. So the majority of the coffee organically produced is by indigenous groups, and they can primarily be found in Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. And why is that correlation also so important to mention? Because for them, organic farming has been something that they can relate to, because it has to do with their indigenous beliefs. Respect to land, respect to water, respect to plants, minimal or no use of agrochemicals, and the ability to produce coffee in this enormous biodiversity. It is one of the things why also Mexico became one of the most key important countries to produce organic coffee. Almost 10% of all farmers farm organically in Mexico. So what then happened? Basically, in 2013, Roya hit, and it hit fast. There was no support, real support from the government, and Roya quickly moved up to the north. At that moment in time, basically the producers and the organization were actually quite angry, so to say. They were demanding support from the government, and they were not receiving it. A change of government took place in 2015, and that actually led to a new startup of the coffee program. In October 2015, a new program was set up, and the aim was set up an emergency plan for the coffee producers. What happened from there is basically meetings. Meetings in order, and asamblea, so to say, in order to define what is necessary currently now for the coffee sector. Because the production was going so low that some people even were predicting that we will be reaching 1.9 million bags. So the program that was set up on incentives, basic incentives for coffee production. It was seeds, based from rust-resistant varieties, plants, nurseries, and inputs. At the end of 2016, we invested $71.5 million and reaching over 142,000 farmers. For this year, we have planned a little bit more than $40 million, and we're hoping to reach 40,000 farmers. An additional assistance program has been set up for around like 500 technical assistants. But still, you can imagine, Mexico is big. The farmers are very dispersed. Chad just mentioned data. Data, I think it's very key here. And I want to give you this example in order to shed a bit of a light on what we're facing. I'm giving you the example of 3 case studies that we have been following in Chiapas. Traditional farming, we actually say, a farmer that actually doesn't do that much on the farm, very little. He actually is producing 5 quintales. And he is spending around $40 per quintal, very low. This is basically only his manual labor being calculated in. Compared to the organic farmer, who actually is focused on being organic and implementing his good practices, this farmer is actually making 20 quintales and investing $100 per quintal. Still quite low if you compare it to other countries. Then the other example is the conventional farmer survey, but a technified one. He actually uses agrochemicals and chemical fertilizer and is able to produce 25 quintales, spending $110 per quintal. As you can see, if you could invest $60 more, you'll be quadrupling your production. This is just a simple example of a couple of case studies that we're following. We're sure that we need much more information to validate certain of this information. But for this example, it is key to show that the productivity is very important in order to reach and have that farmer have the required cost of productions in order to get to that profitable sustainability of his farm. And not only that, also reach that ultimate productivity. It's not that easy, so to say. This will not just be implemented as such, because there are many complex issues behind it as well. We currently very much ask ourselves as a question, as a team, so what's the next phase? We want to make that transition from that emergency modus that we were in. I want to make a plan for the next few years. So how do we go about it? It's a big puzzle. So, as I just mentioned, this program is currently running under the governmental program. Now, as many as you know, governments are always not that stable. And Mexico, unfortunately, is a similar situation. So if we leave the coffee program under the current governmental institution, so to say, it probably have a lot of affectation of instability. Next year we have election. Who says that this program will then not be halted? Simply because other people will be in place. So this definitely is not an answer for us. The answer is clear. We need to build up that institution again for Mexico. In order to make that institution work, there needs to be long-term strategy. And this will not be an institution just with the public sector. No, what we're looking for is that it contains the specialities of professionals from the public and private sector. A mindset change. Currently, we're facing in Mexico a certain dependency to agriculture governmental support. And we are very much aware that at the moment, the program that we set up was needed to be set up. There was no other way. These incentives, although part of basic production, needed to be incentivized by the government because simply the farmers were not able to pay for any of these things. However, you create that dependency. And what we would like to see is actually that these farmers are capable to fund those types of costs themselves, that it's part of their whole business case. Not only that, we need to do that. So that mindset change with them will cost quite some time. But we hope that throughout the explanation on where we want to go with them will help in part of that. Shift of resources. So one of the things we believe what can create that mind shift change is basically that they have an incentive to invest again in their farm. That means that they need to have that rotative working capital. For us as a public sector, in order to provide for that, we need to have that funding in place. We need to have the ability to work with those resources and provide them financial mechanism that currently they don't have, or very little. This will also allow us to focus on, with that shift of resources, to also invest in investigations, research, dissemination of that knowledge. And this all contributes to the resilience and the efficiency of the coffee farmers. One other thing, an important one, and I just mentioned it as well, data collection. As Mexico, we lack tremendously good capturing of data. It is many institutions that work with certain data, but the accuracy sometimes lacks. Also, when it comes to cost of production, with all those 15 regions, we should capture that because it allows us as a public sector to understand better what are the needs of each of these regions, because not every single region is the same. So, having said that, we're putting everything on the table as such. What we see is that private and public collaboration is very much needed because that will allow for us the sustainability in our sector. This is not a job just for the public sector. No, this is a job of the full sector and all the stakeholders that are in it. We see also that the reward system within coffee, the quality aspect for the producers and between the buyers is a tremendous incentive for the producers. And this will definitely help them to reinvest again on their farms. One of the things that we're hoping to achieve with this is that by providing those public funding in those public resources, we can work with other private sector actors in order to support to the same farmers in a sense. I recently visited Pedro. Pedro is from Aldama, from Los Altos de Chiapas. And he basically is from a Tzotzil family. He already farms for over 20 years. Has around 3 to 4 hectares. Farms primarily organic, although not certified. And he sells his coffee to a local cafeteria. And I visited him, and he was very enthusiastic because he wanted to share with me his future outlook on his farm. And he was actually making money again. So he's telling me, so with that extra money I'm making again, I want to invest again in my farm. I want to produce more, and I want to try different type of methods. And at one point, his eyes lit up, and he said to me, I actually got an 87 last week for my coffee. And he was so proud. And I think seeing Pedro and seeing the condition he lives in, that actually formed for him an incentive to continue to reinvest in his coffee farm. So for us in Mexico, we are very much aware that we are in a critical phase. And that critical phase means that we put all forces on the table. We need to collaborate. We need to ally. We need to work together. We need to share and disseminate knowledge, the research. We need to think outside the box. We need to create that collective impact with the sector. Because only this way we are able to use our resources more efficiently, more wisely, more intelligently. And that will help us in order to facilitate the tools back to the farmers again, because they are the real warriors of this industry. And that will allow them to become more knowledgeable and more resilient. Thank you.